Okay, so thank you all for taking time to come for today. It's been really fantastic to hear everyone else's talks. I've learned so much. I was saying to someone I was sitting next to a few minutes ago, I used to be a developer many years ago, but I started doing COBOL 85 on mainframes, and I'm not going to pretend that that's even relevant anymore. But today, my talk is called Death and How Tech Forgot About Mortality. And I think the title does probably feel a bit alarming, but hopefully we'll see as we go through. It's a really important subject that's under-researched, and we need to talk about these kind of things a lot more. So before I do any of my talks, what I like to do is to take a moment to acknowledge the writers, artists, and researchers who inspire my thinking and my vision. And I do this for three reasons. First of all, when I look at the screen like this, although I'm very big, it makes me feel very small, and I think that's a good thing. Secondly, it reminds us that we build on the work of each other. We collaborate, we take inspiration from, we cite, and we take, it's really important to acknowledge the influences that build what we're trying to do. And thirdly, I'll always like to try and push back against the prevailing narrative in technology and design that we're lone geniuses or individually brilliant, but actually our work is collective and it happens in combination with others. The image you see here is called X-ray Portraits, and it goes throughout this talk that I'm doing today. It's by two Japanese artists called Seiko Kenda and Mayako Hayashi. And what strikes me about this image is X-rays always communicate to us the idea of frailty, mortality, and sickness. But in this series of artworks they've done, they picture couples in very close, intimate embrace, and it kind of subverts the idea and the association we have with X-rays, mortality, and skeletons. It shows us that the symbol of death can also be communicative of life, vitality, and hope for the future. So taking time to go through a talk like this, I hope we can use this image as a way of rethinking how we approach the subject of death and mortality. Now, this is the second talk I wrote this year, and it's always a bit nerve-wracking when you're staring at a blank file and you're doing it for the second time around, because you start to doubt yourself a lot. You think, well, it's a bit like second album syndrome, and not that I've ever recorded an album, but you start to think, well, this is going to be alienating to my core audience. It's going to be a really weird concept album that will lose my fans. But actually, the more I start to think about second albums, I reflected on my favorite rappers, singers, songwriters, and actually some of their best work were done second time around. And this has got nothing to do with my talk, but it's just a way of showing how productive creative procrastination can be. So if you're struggling, take that as inspiration. So let's begin by going back in time to 2004. And it seems like such a long time ago, but it's not really that long ago. 2004, such a exciting time for me. I'll start taking my early steps in figuring out what the internet was all about. And if you knew me 20 years ago, I would have still been this height, maybe a little bit slimmer. But I want to start thinking about some of the things that we would have seen on a screen if we would have been using desktop computers probably back in 2004. If you and me were friends back then, you might have been getting emails from me on MSN, Hotmail. That was the thing to have. If you had your Hotmail address, that was such a status symbol. If you were a really good friend of mine, we definitely would have been messaging on MSN Messenger late into the night, sending each other lots of nonsense messages that were really important, but actually, when we look back now, not so important at all. And this was something that was really transformative for me. This first steps into social media. It wasn't really called social media back then, or social networking back then. But I discovered this website called Bebo. And if you're of a similar age to me, you may have come across this, you may have used this. The idea that you can connect with people, play games, and share lots of images and pictures, and just discover all these people all around the world. Now, I was still quite early in my professional career. So as like any good executive or wannabe executive, I had executive toys. And I used to have a Scion Series 5 MX with a little stylus and had a touch screen. You could go on there and use lots of different types of apps. And one of the things I was most proud of, I got myself an Ericsson SH888 phone. And for those of you who don't know, this phone had an inbuilt 9K modem with an infrared port. And I used to commute in from Southeast London, and getting on from about Greenwich to London Bridge, I could get that little connection to work and get my email downloaded in the time it took to get from Greenwich to London Bridge, which was amazing. Mobile internet, but yeah, that was back then. But you know what's really surprising or remarkable about this image is that all of these products, all these services, to many degrees, don't really exist anymore. They're all gone, and that was 20 years ago. So little thought is given to the end of life, not only of people, but actually the products and the digital devices and services that we rely on every day. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of Awesome Falsehoods. This is it's a web page that I came across a couple of years ago. And the idea behind Awesome Falsehoods is they gather together lots of cultural references and lots of sort of prevailing ideas that's kind of influence how people think about lots of things in life. And a falsehood basically is it's basically an incorrect idea that you believe that persistently guides your thinking. And they're very, very difficult to spot, and they can feed into the way that we think and actually feed into the way that we go about our work. So what I want to do today with my talk is to talk about the subject of death, but thinking about falsehoods. So let me just give you an example of what falsehoods look like before we get into that. Now, what could be more simple than creating a registration form? Maybe if you've done a coding class or design boot camp or some sort of course like that, you think, what's the most simple thing to put together is a registration form. First name, last name, email address. Easy. Now, when you start thinking about falsehoods, it starts to present lots of little problems about your assumptions, because the more you dig into it, the more it starts to make these things more complicated. So, for example, with your falsehoods, people's names are assigned at birth. Well, actually, that's not really true, because there's always a gap between when someone was born and when they're officially recognized in terms of their name. People have one full name by which they go by. People's names are case sensitive, and actually culturally, different parts of the world, case sensitivity is actually very important. So whether your name is uppercase or lowercase, that becomes a very big concern. People's names are not written in all caps, and sometimes people's names are not written in all lowercase letters. And actually falsehoods, the more you look at them, can start to become contradictory as well. So all of a sudden, something that you think is so simple to present in a digital system, you start to introduce this concept of falsehoods. It makes these things really, really complicated, contradictory, and very, very knotty. So what I want to do today is think about falsehoods, particularly the falsehoods that exist about death, and how do they show up in our digital services. Now, there's very little research about this kind of subject, particularly with digital services. So these things I'm going to show you today, I'm not supposed to present a complete list. This is very far from complete. I'm hoping it's going to inspire and encourage you to start thinking how you can add to this and iterate on it as well. So I'm going to do three things. As you can see, I like alliterations. I want to talk about person, how death affects the data that belongs to each of us as individuals. I'm going to talk about platform, how platforms often die before the people, you and I, who use their services. I'm going to talk about pieces, and this is to think about the materiality of technology and how technological objects that contain our data are actually dying as well. So first of all, let's think about personhood. Now, because of many cultural and social reluctances, the idea of talking about death can be very difficult, and I appreciate that. I know it's something that affects us all in many different ways. But because of that, it doesn't get the critical attention that it requires. And actually, it's so important for us, first of all, to think about what happens when a person dies. And as a designer or design researcher, we like to think in neat journeys. So we think, well, first thing that happens is that a will maybe is produced or exists, and that expresses what happens to someone's property. Secondly, we think, well, there's this thing called the law, and the law governs of how the estate is managed and how it's transferred. And thirdly, well, we've got all these property assets that are distributed to individuals, maybe different parties. But you know, the most important thing to realize is that when someone dies, we don't follow these neat journeys. We don't follow this very methodical way of going through these things. And actually, on top of that, we tend to think, well, there's a process and lots of people will be able to follow this process. And this is where my first falsehood comes in. First falsehood is that most of us have a plan for our death. We tend to think that, so we design services on the assumption that there's a neat path that people will follow. But actually, even in the UK today, up to 3 in 5 of UK adults have not made a will. And actually, for people who do have a will, I mean, in a time of great distress, you're not going to be thinking logically, methodically, and following a 1, 2, 3 step process like that. So it's really important to take that as a first point. So what about digital? Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit more messy and a little bit more complicated, because our own lives are messy and unpredictable. And I like to have this idea of digital selves. And the digital selves, your existence that exists in these digital environments. And we exist as a result of multi-directional relationships between people across platforms. And one of the things that's really important to think about is those assets, those photos, videos, reels, DMs, reactions, likes, texts, all of these things that make up our digital selves. And we've had to start thinking about these as the terms of social labor. So we exist digitally, but it's actually the product of how we interact with other people within these platforms. Now, a person will differ across and within platforms. And I say in public, in private, and in secret. So first of all, who decides the ownership of a public profile? Some social media profiles can have tens of thousands of followers, or even a few hundred, but actually who's to decide who owns or has ownership of that? And we exist in private. So many things that I would put in my private notes, I don't want anyone else to see, inner monologues or thoughts of self-reflection. Should that be just made openly accessible? And thirdly, in secret. Now you may think, well, why would you want to exist in secret? And there are many reasons why some aspects of your digital self need to be kept hidden from others. Things to do with your own sexuality, family connections, relationships that are hidden from families or within families. And it's very true that across many parts of the world, if you are in an authoritarian regime, journalists, activists, political dissidents need to have certain aspects of their identity very, very secret. So it starts to complicate things, because that neat 1, 2, 3 process that we use with physical assets doesn't really work with digital. And we're starting to realize that this becomes more and more complicated. And this is where my second falsehood comes in, that our digital selves are consistent, but actually when you look at it, that's not true at all. We exist across and within platforms, in public, in private, and in secret. Now, Coachella 2012, let's take another trip back. You can see I was very nostalgic when I was putting this together. I've never been to this festival, but I get really excited talking about it because it just looks fantastic. It's just like, to me, it's like Glastonbury, but with good weather. And it's in California. They always have funny weather and thousands of people going there. Now, there's a reason I picked Coachella 2012. It seems like a weird period of time, but if you notice from the lineup, I'm most excited by that last weekend where Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg are performing. I've never seen them live. I've always wanted to, but this particular performance was really notable for a very important reason. So 1996, Tupac Shakur were one of the biggest rappers at the time, next to Biggie Smalls. Tupac was very publicly murdered in 1996. But in Coachella 2012, what was really surprising and shocked the whole crowd gathered there at that time, there was a hologram performance of Tupac that joined Dre and Snoop Dogg on stage. And they performed some songs. And aside of him being resurrected digitally, opened up worrying questions for us today. Now, back then, it took a lot of resource and teams to build this kind of apparition. But technology has moved on so much since then that this kind of apparition, this kind of digital recreation is so much more easier. Because a Tupac hologram, to me, represents a contradiction of the mental model we have towards digital existence. We think, well, I live, I die, and I cease to exist. But digitally, your existence doesn't end when you die. I like to think about these things from a critical sense. And this book, Morte Vivum, written by Kimberly Juanita Brown, It's a critical look at the politics of photography as a visual medium, and particularly when it comes to the representation of Black people in online cultures and the way the visual image has been used to capture and monetize and extract from Black performance, particularly in a public setting, is something that is really important for us to think of critically as well. And in this comment that she makes in this book, she notes how performing the structural racism it embodies is really a reflection of the viewer's indifference, because you can see this apparition performing for our enjoyment and for our pleasure, but this life that has been extinguished is just trapped in this digital vacuum on a loop, and it's something that's worrying to me. Now, 100 billion, this is a very big figure, and estimates of this so-called grief tech, I know there's always a new tech sector that's always being named, but grief tech is apparently a thing now. These kind of startups and companies that claim to have end-of-life solutions and these kind of things. But apparently, the value of this market, according to some research, is up to 100 billion pounds worldwide. And the irony is there's so many companies that try to get involved with this, but they never really last that long. And to appeal to your cynical side, you may think to yourself, well, if that's 100 billion of what money out there for taking, we could take more interest in this if you were that cynically way inclined. But I know most of you, all of you in this room won't be like that. But there are lots of companies who don't have such scruples about them. And there are loads of these solutions just proliferating at the moment. In the top left, this software is called Here and After. It's an app you can download that with a little bit of text, or I think the backup of some messages, you can create a digital synthetic version of a lost loved one you can speak to. Similarly, with Replica AI, you can do something very similar. The top right one is called seance.ai. You can really see they're going to town with these names. And the bottom right one is called My Heritage, where with a few photos, how many photos, they can reanimate these photos and you can see them smile and move and do all kinds of things. Yeah, it kind of leaves a nasty taste in the mouth when you look at this. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is that we may think that our existence ends when our life ends. Digital existence ends when our life ends. But the reality is now, we're not living in the world of Tupac, Coachella 2012. You need to have a team to fill this room to create these kind of things. With a few clicks and a little transaction, you can have something running on your phone with very little effort. So this is where the falsehood comes in. Death ends our digital existence, but actually we can see here, private companies can and are technologically reanimating the dead. And the question I'm asking is, should they be doing that? So let's just tie this up. With persons, with people, with individuals, I said that most of us do not have a plan for our death. 3 in 5 UK adults don't have a will. And even if you do have all your documentation in place, we don't work in neat user journeys when you're in a state of distress. Second, our digital selves are not consistent. We exist across platforms, in public, in private, and also in secret. And that complicates the idea of taking everything that one person owns in the digital realm and giving it to a single person or entity. And thirdly, death does not end our digital existence. And as we saw from that recent example, there's lots of private companies out there that are rubbing their hands at the prospect of making a lot of money. So let's think about platforms. What's your darling app? And I'm going to be very honest, I think for me, it's Instagram. I love it and I hate it, but I keep going back to it. And it's always very difficult to sort of grapple with this. And, these, as many speakers have said, these apps are designed deliberately to keep us hooked, to keep us engaged. But what would you do if tomorrow, one of these, or even if all of these, if you were to open up your phone tomorrow, they're just shut down, they were no longer there? Now, consider the speed with which Twitter is imploded. We've talked about this quite a few times today. But it's really important to just critique the way that technology companies talk about themselves. They often refer to themselves as the public town square. And the language they use to sort of frame their existence is trying to insinuate that they have some sort of civic duty towards you. But actually, we have to remind ourselves, these are for private corporations acting for the benefit and the interests of their shareholders. So this is where my falsehood comes in. Platforms, we think, are obliged to provide us a service, but actually they're private corporations that have no civic, moral obligation to you. Now, maybe I'm still traumatized by the loss of Bebo, so this is my dedication to Bebo. The social network was so terrible, it died twice. But there's a whole corporate story behind that. We don't have time for it today, but it's just incompetence and just cat-handedness that, yeah, it died twice. But the thing with this, it's really important to understand, because this is such a good example of how we can put so much of your life and existence into this. And with a few bad business decisions or a few wrong turns, the actual whole company just imploded. And very strangely for a company like this, they just took the decision to just take the whole thing offline. I can't remember if it was the first or second time, but yeah, they just took the whole thing offline. Now, when you have someone who's close to you, someone that you know, who has their essence on that network, you can no longer get that data. And that's really something that we should be troubled by a lot more. So this is where my first falsehood in platforms comes in, is that we think that platforms will always be there, but actually takeover, strategic change, bankruptcy, any of these things can make these platforms disappear almost overnight, like a puff of smoke. Yeah, Twitter, the spirit of Twitter is really running through very strongly throughout today. But yeah, it's fascinating how many anecdotes and case studies they provide. So Twitter a few years ago, they came up with a really great idea to, you know what, we've got too many inactive accounts in our network. We just need to just get rid of them. And this is a couple of years ago where they came up with this idea. And then there's a whole backlash because people are saying, well, hang on a minute, you can't just delete people's accounts that aren't active, because there are lots of people's accounts who've been inactive for lots of reasons. And most importantly, you know, people who are no longer alive, those accounts are precious. Those words mean something to us. So in the eyes of the corporation, the active account is a productive account because it means there's eyeballs, there's interaction, there's ad revenue to be made. But for that sort of very binary understanding of value, when the account is inactive, it's no longer useful to them as a profit-making organization. And this is where the second falsehood comes in, because we tend to we think of the existence of the digital and user value in the sense that all users are alive. But we have to remember that just because an account exists, it doesn't mean that the person is alive. And lots of decisions need to be made about how that account is treated, whether it's preserved, whether it's memorialized, or how that interaction is agreed. Now, one of the books that really triggered my interest in this subject is a book called Death Glitch by Tamara Neese. And she goes into a lot of detail about this subject with really useful and very interesting case studies. And one of the things she says is that she critiques the tech platforms because she says that they do not anticipate death and how it affects users, because platforms focus on sources of value in the context of living, breathing users. So maybe my challenge to you, if you're a service, product, or platform designer, is to think about your users, not in terms of them living, but also in terms of them being dead and what that means for their existence in your service or platform. So we think about the platforms, and then just to remind ourselves, platforms are not obliged to provide you or I a service. They're private corporations, and have no civic or moral obligation to serve you. Secondly, platforms will not always be here, and we've seen that very clearly with recent events. Thirdly, all users are not alive, because just because an account is there, it doesn't necessarily mean that person is living. So third, I want to talk about pieces. And this is really about the materiality of the internet. And I love the language of how we use to describe technology. And it's something that fascinates me greatly. And the way that the internet, or certain elements of the internet, is described today is really important to just stop and think where that comes from. Because we forget that in this cloud era, the internet is still made up of cables and disks and hard drives, routers and servers, fans and moving parts, and these are housed in very physical buildings. So the hardware needs constant care and maintenance, and we need to be sure that we keep our mind focused on this. Now, if you're above a certain age, you probably remember the time when you used to manage your own hardware. For me, my first computer was a tower PC, which I kept under my desk at home at the time. And you managed your storage, and you had your physical material disks and other things that kept your computer running. So our digital self can only exist when the code, when the hardware, and when all these infrastructures of storage are carefully maintained in unison. Today, that is kind of abstracted to a distance where we don't actually do this ourselves, but it's still very important to keep this in mind. Now, when you think of materiality, we think of decay and we think of things breaking down. And bit rot is a really big problem if you're working in infrastructure of technology and storage. The decay of electromagnetic charge is a massive, massive problem in keeping the data preserved and the integrity protected. And it affects all kinds of storage media. And it's something that we don't really see because, again, we talk about the cloud. It's just, we put stuff on our phone, it just disappears and it's backed up. We don't think about it. But this is a really big issue to take note of. And there are many fine organizations doing work to try and counter this. The Internet Wayback Machines, this is actually a non-profit organization who had such concern of web pages disappearing at a rate that they've stepped in to try and, keep these things online. The Flickr Foundation doing really important research to look at how to preserve their digital photos 100 years, which isn't even a long time, but this is really important research that's been taking place. So it reminds us that in this falsehood, if we think our data is saved, it's safe, that's wrong, because hardware failure, obsolescence, and bit rot, all of these things are threatening the integrity of our saved data. Another book I read, which is really very searching, very difficult questions about the materiality and the infrastructure of the internet, is called Internet for the People by Ben Tarnoff. And in this book, he traces the whole history of the privatization of the internet, particularly its infrastructures. And one of the things that caught me about this book is just the idea of the value of data. And actually, when you think of data, and in this text he says that we think data is made collectively and made valuable collectively. Well, it should follow that governance should also be collective. Crucially, the ownership of data would be separated from its processing. And actually, the more you peel back the layers of this idea of digital existence and death and inheritance, we can't separate it from the idea of data and who owns it and who governs it and the whole model of governance that goes around that. So the internet is dying. We need to rewind and remind ourselves the fabric of our digital cells is in constant decay. You or I may not be individually responsible for maintaining the internet infrastructures, and we are far removed from it, but the labor exists and has to be carried out to ensure that our tweets, likes, and DMs never get lost. So if you came looking for a talk that is going to give you a 3-step solution to solving this problem, I won't be doing that. But we're in a 5-step method for that matter. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but no, it's sometimes these things need to be grappled with. Now, one of the things that really impresses me is to sort of break away from the screen, to try and make your point real and tangible. And I know it's ironic to say this talking with a PowerPoint, but get away from the PowerPoint. So 2 researchers who I met at a conference earlier this summer, actually it's at a conference called The Conference in Malmö in Sweden, Emily Best and Sarah Watson. They have a project called A People's History of Tech. And in this project they've been running for a couple of years, they're running this project to basically collectively build the timeline of technology, and particularly related to the mobile phone. And in this kiosk you could walk into, you could see people's contributions talking about their experiences of using a mobile phone. I think the mobile phone is such an important artifact culturally and also historically, because it's more from this device that was actually built to just make phone calls to now we have our whole lives on it, photos and our banking and all kinds of things that make up who we are. And many anonymous contributions have been made and messages, and I like this one at the bottom here, an anonymous submission where this person has written that texting became a critical part of how I created and nurtured a relationship. And it's just that sort of very intimate knotting of, I guess, your sociality and your existence in this technological device that so quickly stops working. I mean, they barely work after 3 years. So the People's History of Tech is a fantastic website to engage with, just to get a really good idea of how we can rethink how we talk about these things. So with pieces falsehoods, I don't really have much in terms to say about this, but I think one falsehood to really emphasize is this, that saved data is not safe. And just the idea that that word save is so closely associated with the way that we keep data demands more interrogation. But actually hardware failure, obsolescence, and bit rot, all of these things are threatening the integrity of our saved data. So let's make it practical. One of the common complaints I've had when I've, well, not complaints, but suggestions I've had when I pitch this to other conferences. I always want like a punchy 1, 2, 3 action steps. So this is my little gesture to that, as a way of thinking, okay, what can you do to make this practical? You go back on a Monday, it's always that Monday morning effect that you go back to your desk and think, okay, how can I put this into action? So let's talk about those 3 strands, or the 3 falsehoods. So you think about the person. Maybe this is a question you could ask if you're ideating or in any sort of design process. What is our service's role when a user dies? And this is not asked enough. It always surprised me when you go and even to some big tech services, social media platforms, you try and look for information of what happens when a user dies. And basically the answer is just email support and then nothing much more than that. Digital services and experiences are often designed assuming users are only ever alive, and that needs to change. Secondly, you think about platforms. You want to ask critical questions about that. How will users get their data if our service ends? That's really important because technology companies, for some reason, they just only ever imagine that users they only ever imagine that they will exist longer than the users, which isn't true. And thirdly, for pieces, will users' data be accessible 50 years from now? And this is such a short period of time when you look at the whole history of humanity. But beneath all of this data and this hardware infrastructure, there's a lot of labor that goes into making these things accessible. So back to 2004, what will the computing landscape look like even in a few years from now? I don't know. I'm not going to make a prediction. But what I do know is that this is an under-researched problem that needs a lot more attention. Whatever your role is within your organization, this needs much more attention. Coda. In 1850, Renty and Delia Taylor, there were an enslaved father and daughter who were forcibly photographed on the instruction of Louis Agassiz, a Swiss biologist. Stripped of their dignity, these photos were artifacts of a racist imagination desperate to prove Africans as subhuman. So in 2021, the artist Sasha Huber produced the artwork Tailoring Freedom, which you see here, and she uses staples as a symbol of repair, binding solid material, repairing wounded flesh, so that Renty and Delia are reclothed with dignity. So Sasha Huber, she donated this artwork to Tamara Lanier, the great-great-great-granddaughter of Renty. And the reason I bring this artwork up in this talk is to show that to this day, Tamara campaigns through the courts system in America for the release of these original photos, which are currently owned by Harvard University. So Agassiz's name is memorialized all over the world in landmarks, mountains to street names to public statues. And in contrast, the photos of Renty and Delia are representations of how the image and the technological twin can in fact be imprisoned. And in this recent book by Legacy Russell, the author of Glitch Feminism, Black Meme, this book came out earlier this year, she talks about this. She says that Renty and Delia are forever trapped in the architecture of their photographic frame, now transformed into an infinitely scrolling browser tab. Fetishized within an institutional archive, their captured images are simultaneously rendered silent and stripped of agency. And that's the thing that haunts me, is that this existence that we have in these digital environments are extractive and they will imprison. And particularly when you look at the history of exploitation towards the black figure in American culture, which is basically our internet culture, these things are ones that I want to alert us to. So I started my talk with a clear title, Confronting the Reality of Death. Our technologies and modes of communication, they can, and they always will change. 10, 20 years from now, we'll be talking about something totally different. But these futures, these oppressive futures, are not inevitable. We don't need to accept the destiny of being trapped in an infinitely scrolling browser tab, as Legacy Russell writes, AI-generated or otherwise. In fact, when examining death, we ought to contend with the logics and the power structures and ideologies that seek possession of our digital selves. So I want to reframe my thinking and turn the title from How Death Forgot About Mortality and reframe it and say that how death can embrace mortality. Thank you.